I want to begin with three numbers that should send a cold shock through anyone who actually understands how global power works when the cameras are off and the statements stop sounding polite. 12 commercial vessels seized in a single coordinated operation, 40 Russian naval units active across three separate maritime theaters, and roughly $3 billion worth of assets now sitting under direct Russian control, effectively frozen in place. Washington reacted with outrage, strong language, emergency consultations, and the usual public performance of disbelief. But here is the uncomfortable truth that almost no one in Western leadership wants to admit openly. This was not an emotional outburst. It was not an impulsive move, and it was not some reckless gamble taken in anger. It was a deliberate strategy, executed patiently, legally framed with care, and most disturbingly of all, it was modeled almost entirely on precedents that the United States and its allies themselves established over the past several years. To understand what just happened, you have to stop thinking about this as a naval incident and start seeing it for what it really is: a lesson in power projection through commerce, law, and controlled escalation. In waters bordering Russia, from the Black Sea to the Baltic approaches and deep into the Arctic shipping lanes, Russian forces moved with military precision, launching near-simultaneous seizures of LNG carriers and oil tankers operated by American companies or sailing under Allied flags, and every one of those actions was wrapped in a legal justification so dense and procedural that Western legal teams are still combing through the language trying to figure out where exactly the line was crossed. The immediate Western response followed a familiar script: shock, emergency summits, threats of consequences, and warnings about escalation. But anyone who has spent years watching foreign policy unfold knows something felt different this time, because the surprise was real, and that should worry us far more than the seizures themselves. It tells us that Western strategic planners failed to anticipate a move that, in hindsight, was practically telegraphed. We missed it because we were operating under a flawed assumption, one that many people still hold today, which is the belief that international maritime law functions as a protective shield for commercial shipping, a neutral framework that keeps trade insulated from great power conflict. On paper, those treaties exist. In theory, those protections matter. In reality, rules only have meaning if there is a neutral authority willing and able to enforce them, and the moment enforcement itself becomes a weapon, those rules begin to dissolve into something else entirely. To see how we arrived at this point, you have to go back to late 2022, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when the United States and its allies rolled out what they proudly described as the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. Banking access was cut off. Assets were frozen across multiple jurisdictions. An oil price cap was imposed with the stated goal of keeping Russian energy on the global market while limiting the revenue flowing back to Moscow, thereby draining its ability to fund the war. From Washington's perspective, this looked like a smart, calibrated move. It was framed as a precision strike, a way to apply pressure without triggering a wider conflict. But from Moscow's perspective, it looked very different. It looked like the West was unilaterally declaring control over the global energy trade. The message Russia heard was simple and humiliating. You can sell your resources, but only at prices your enemies approve, and only through systems they dominate. And this message was enforced not with missiles or blockades, but through Western control of shipping insurance, financial clearing, port access, and logistical networks. The ultimatum was clear: follow our rules or your ships do not move. For nearly 2 years, Russia absorbed that pressure. It took economic damage. It lost revenue. It watched its access to Western systems collapse. But it did not sit still. Quietly, methodically, it began building alternatives. Exports were redirected toward Asia. New buyers were cultivated. Arctic shipping routes were expanded at a pace many analysts had dismissed as unrealistic. Financial channels were developed that bypassed Western banks entirely. These were not improvised survival tactics. They were preparations for a future in which Russian trade no longer required Western permission. And then, in late 2024, the dynamic shifted again. The United States and its allies moved from financial enforcement to physical enforcement. Western naval forces began boarding and inspecting tankers in international waters, citing suspicions that those vessels were bypassing the oil price cap. The justification was sanctions enforcement, but the practical reality was unmistakable. Economic policy had crossed the line into physical coercion. Ships were stopped. Crews were questioned. Cargoes were scrutinized. Moscow watched all of it carefully. Every boarding was documented. Every legal argument was analyzed. Every instance in which the West asserted authority over global commerce was recorded, not for protest, but for replication. Russia was studying the playbook. Then, in mid-December, Moscow found the catalyst it needed. An American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in northern waters, an incident that resulted in the deaths of several Russian sailors. Washington called it a tragic accident. Moscow rejected that explanation. Russian officials claimed the tanker was engaged in intelligence activity and demanded that it return to Russian jurisdiction for a criminal investigation. When the ship refused, Russia labeled the crew fugitives. At that point, the factual details almost stopped mattering. What mattered was that Russia framed the incident not as a military confrontation, but as a criminal case. That distinction was critical. By defining the situation as a law enforcement matter rather than an act of war, Moscow created a legal pretext for actions that could be presented as policing rather than aggression. What followed was not chaos. It was coordination. Russian naval units moved in sync across multiple maritime zones. 12 vessels were boarded. Crews were escorted into Russian ports. Hundreds of commercial sailors, ordinary people with no stake in geopolitics, saw their legal status change overnight. They were not declared hostages. They were labeled material witnesses. That technical distinction matters on paper, but in practice, those crews became leverage in a geopolitical confrontation they never signed up for. What Russia accomplished in that moment was something far more significant than the seizure of a dozen ships. It directly challenged the foundational assumption of modern global trade, the belief that commercial shipping exists in a neutral space, separate from great power rivalry. Moscow shattered that assumption by using the very same logic the West had normalized. The argument is brutally straightforward. If the United States can board tankers in international waters to enforce sanctions, Russia can board tankers using different legal justifications. If Western systems can be weaponized to control prices and access, Russian military power can be weaponized to control movement and security. This is strategic mirroring, and it is designed to force Western policymakers to confront a question they have spent years avoiding. Can you dictate global rules without exposing yourself to the same vulnerabilities? The human cost of this approach is already visible. Families thousands of miles away are watching their lives get turned upside down. Crews are stuck in legal limbo. Companies are bleeding money. And this is always how it begins. When commerce becomes a battlefield, ordinary people pay the price first. But the real danger lies ahead. If this precedent holds, maritime shipping enters a far more unstable era. Every modern ship carries electronics. Any hostile state can claim those systems are surveillance tools. Environmental regulations are broad enough to justify almost any inspection. The line between security enforcement and economic hostage-taking is fading fast, and Russia is not the only one paying attention. China is watching closely. Iran is watching. Others are watching too, calculating whether the West truly has the capacity and the will to protect every ship, every route, and every commercial interest under this emerging reality. What we are witnessing is not the collapse of order through a single dramatic event, but the slow erosion of accepted norms, one precedent at a time, and the energy markets have already started adjusting. Insurance premiums near